Hey guys, we are looking at the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, and we're going to be talking about the Greek Archaic period, okay? This Greek Archaic period was kind of around 800 BC. This Greek culture begins to show signs of revival. They're starting to come back as a people and as a prominent people in the world at this point. This Archaic period lasts approximately 300 years until about 500 BC. During this time, the Greek population grows significantly. There's increased contact with other lands, and Greek art improves, and Greek writing is rediscovered and developed during this time. Also, during this time, because the population is growing, there's some colonies. The first Greek colonies are set out. They're leaving the Greek mainland, and this starts around 1000 BC, and in search of new lands. Some of the reasons they're leaving is because of the famines. There's struggles between the states. There's overcrowding because of the population growth. These colonies are new areas, and these new areas grow into independent states. There's different locations. One primary one is Ionia, and that's the very first Greek colony. It is on the coast of Asia Minor, which is in modern-day Turkey. But they also have colonies popping up all around the Mediterranean Sea, from France all the way to the Black Sea. Most of these colonies are in places with a natural port and good farmland. The trade and commerce kind of develops because of these colonies. Trade grows between Greek cities and the colonies. Also, during this time, trade kind of grows with the Phoenicians, and that increases. These merchants basically sail from port to port to port, and they're buying and selling goods as they go. These Greek colonies act as staging areas and staging posts for Greek trade within foreign lands. And most of what they're trading, and one of the biggest, trades that they are, is grain trade. Many of the Greek cities can't grow enough to feed all of its people. Grain, and mostly barley, was the most crucial import during this time. An example of this is at Athens. They, in Athens, had to import 2/3 of all its grain from these Greek colonies around the shores of the Black Sea to be able to survive and feed their people. During this time, we also have the rise of Greek city-states. A city-state is essentially a political independent city that's acting as a state or a country, okay? Mainland Greece was made up of a cluster of small city-states. Ultimately, these are politically independent from each other. And they use the word polis, P-O-L-I-S, okay? And that is the Greek word for city-state, like metropolis, acropolis, right? The P-O-L-I-S. The P-O-L-I-S is also the origin of our word politics. All of these city-states on the mainland shared some common Greek identity. They shared a common language. They shared most of the same culture. They shared a common religion. And because of these common interests, it created strong links and ties between these city-states. And even though they were rivals and sometimes fought each other, there was a strong connection amongst them. So what was a city-state like? Well, usually they were fairly small. Athens was the largest of the city-states, and it only had just a few thousand citizens. They were single cities that were enclosed by walls and had surrounding countryside that went with them. Inside the walls, you had an acropolis, or an area of high ground, and an agora, which was an open area used for markets and meetings. Of course, you also had homes and palaces and, places for religious ceremonies and things like that. Everything you would expect inside a normal city. Also in these cities, these city-states, you had two main societal groups, okay? You had freemen. And freemen, and part of this classification of freemen, included their wives and their family, their children. These people could vote, own property, etc. Then you had slaves. The slaves were obviously owned by the freemen. They had no legal rights. And even though they lived closely with the owners and were kind of treated like members of the family, they were rarely granted their true freedom. Also, during this time, these city-states kind of went through a whole bunch of different types of rule. And they started out with what's called an aristocracy. And this was kind of mostly at the very beginning of this archaic period. And an aristocracy is a rule by aristocrats, which are rich landowners. And they had a large group of them, and they would rule together to kind of decide what was going to happen in the city-state. The next type of rule is oligarchy, which is rule just by the few. And usually what happened was this. Their aristocracy was formed, and all these landowners were together, and they kind of got tired of having to meet to run the city, or they had better things to do on their land, or they just didn't feel like it. And so they would appoint a few different people to, these aristocrats would appoint them to rule over everybody. And so you just got this rule by a few, or oligarchy. Eventually, that rule by few became rule by one. Usually it's a tyrant. And usually one very powerful ruler, and it rules with a very firm hand and without any representation, and just kind of, you're going to do what I say by might, by force. And lastly, they came up with, democracy, and we'll talk about that later. Some of the important rulers during this time was a man named Draco. Draco was a tyrant of Athens around 621 BC. He drew up such a severe set of laws that even minor crimes, such as stealing food, were punished by death. Kind of a clear example of what a tyrant is. Next, you had a ruler named Solon. He was an aristocrat in charge of Athens from 594 BC. He introduced some very popular reforms. He gave food to the poor. He stopped people who owed money from being sold into slavery. Back then, if you owed somebody some money, they could basically say pay. If not, they would sell you on a market to get their money, and you had to become a slave. And he stopped that. He also gave citizens some say in city affairs. So technically he was a tyrant, but he was, what you might call a nice tyrant. But not everybody liked some of these changes. They didn't like what was going on, and eventually he was forced to leave Athens. The last person we'll talk about during this time is Cleisthenes. He came to power in Athens around 508 BC. And he's the one who introduced a new radical system of government that we call democracy. Okay, a very interesting fact that back then they thought it was very radical that the people could decide and people could vote, right? Also during this time, though, there was, as these city-states continued to grow, they had free men inside these cities, and they were just getting larger and larger. And then so in an attempt to kind of control things, they split these free men into two groups. The first group was what we called citizens. And specifically this occurred in Athens. And the citizens were men who were actually born in Athens. These people could take part in politics, but they were also had some responsibilities, and they were expected to serve in the army. They were expected to act as officials when necessary, and they were expected to volunteer for jury service. The other group of free men was called medics, M-E-T-I-C-S, okay? And these medics were free men, but they were not born in Athens. So they limited some of their freedoms or their responsibilities. First, they had to pay taxes and serve in the army. That was something they had to do. But they could not own property or get involved in politics. And so this is some of the changes and some of the things that were going on during this Greek archaic period at the time. And hopefully you're reading the material and you can look at some of this on your own. Thanks.